Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dissecting Dance, Kicking It with Ren podcast, the podcast that opens up discussions about topics in dance. The goal of this podcast is to allow dancers and non dancers alike to think about dance from new perspectives, as well as leaving room for discussion. Enjoy the show! Hello, and welcome to this episode of Dissecting Dance, Kicking It with Ren podcast. My name is Ren, and we have a special guest today. Miss Becca, say hi.
Hi.
So, I it's very hard to give her a, brief introduction because she was very involved in my life from around, I think, fourth or fifth grade up
Sounds
until
great.
up until my junior year of high school. Um, so yeah, um, it's very hard to explain just who she is briefly. So, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my background is a little bit different from most dancers and teachers. I got started as a competitive gymnast, and then my body started to hurt. It got hard and it got scary. After a couple of injuries, I had this fear growing, and I started to do more and more challenging skills, and I was kind of done.
Yeah.
And we had been doing dance class every Friday night for 30 minutes, and I just loved it. I thought it was so much fun. We did
Mhm.
ballet. We did like ballet bar holding onto chairs. And so when I decided gymnastics was done for me, I switched into dancing, and I fell in love with it right away. So that's kind of how I got started in dance. I ended up moving to Pennsylvania, and I danced at a school, danced at the Rock School West for 3 years. And then I attended college at the University of Iowa. I was originally a double major in dance and business, but I started to have some aches and pains come into my dancing back then. And I started seeing physical therapists and chiropractors regularly. So I ended up dropping my business major
Mhm.
and decided if I'm going to do this, I need to do this now. And I
Yeah.
graduated in 3 years because it was going to take me 5 years with my course load, how much they overlapped. So I took like 24 credits a semester, kind of crazy,
Oh
and
my gosh.
finished a 4 year degree in 3 years. I'm a very determined person. So I started auditioning around and anywhere and everywhere I possibly could. My first like potential dance job was with Nashville Ballet. I got invited to attend their summer intensive to see if I was what they were looking for to become, a trainee or apprentice with their
Mhm.
company. I ended up not getting it.
Aw.
Surprise. Dancers will hear no, 100 times more than they'll hear a yes. But I then went and did a summer program at Malashok Dance, and I was on scholarship there. And I was being also looked at to become an apprentice in their modern dance company,
Mhm.
and I didn't get it.
Mhm.
But I did get invited to an audition when I was there, and so I ended up getting that. So I danced with San Diego Dance Theater just as like a little pickup gig. This was like my first paid dance job. It was super exciting.
Mhm.
So I did their trolley dances, which was just a lot of fun. It was really low key. I took ballet wherever I could. I ended up getting another offer while I was there to
Oh,
dance with.
yay.
Yeah, I got asked to dance with California Ballet, but my fiance at the time was all the way over in New York. He
Mhm.
was in law school at Syracuse University, and I decided it was too far to spend a whole
Mhm.
year away from him. So I ended up turning down that contract and moved to New York. So I then found Syracuse City Ballet. At the time, it was upstate New York Ballet. I danced in their Dracula and their Nutcracker. It was not the best place for me.
Mhm.
I had some experiences that were not pleasant. I also did their marketing for them, so I kind of got into admin back then, but that's kind of off topic. So my husband was still fiance at the time, excuse me. He was still finishing law school, and I'm like, well, I can't stay here anymore. There's nothing else here for me. If this doesn't work out, I need to go somewhere else. So I ended up auditioning for Ballet Theater Maryland, and I got accepted as a trainee there.
Mhm.
So that this was my first like full-time company. I was there, I was dancing 6 to 7 days a week. Nutcracker was 7 days a week.
Wow.
And I was dancing 30 to 40 hours a week and waiting tables about 25 hours a week.
Mm.
So that was really, really intense, but it was,
Hmm.
I loved it. I mean, I was all in doing what I loved, dancing for a ballet company, what I always wanted to do. But about November of my first season, I started to have everything hurt.
Hmm.
I got through Nutcracker just barely. I almost got pulled from a piece actually because I quote didn't know the choreography, but really I couldn't focus on the choreography because my body hurt so darn much. I was just trying
Aw.
not to think about the pain and then I would forget all the steps.
Hmm.
So it was a really like I loved it there. I loved dancing there, but that Nutcracker season was really hard. I was literally just trying to get through it. I started seeing a whole bunch of PTs, chiropractors, Pilates instructors. I saw general doctors. I can't tell you how many doctors I saw trying to figure out what was wrong with me. I had doctors telling me, well, maybe it's all in your head. I had people testing me for like Lyme's disease because I had all these aches and pains that hurt in so many different places that they couldn't pinpoint any one thing. Well, turns out I ended up having 7 different injuries.
Oh.
And yeah, some of them were a little bit more serious than others. So I decided it was time to stop, that I needed to stop dancing. So that's when I switched into teaching. I got involved with teaching. I became a school director. I did a little bit of performing again in modern, but just dibble dally there, nothing serious. So I did that for 6 years and really loved teaching. I realized that I wasn't made to be a dancer because I was meant to be a teacher.
Hmm.
But I
I
was
agree
also,
with that.
yeah, and I was also meant to go through what I went through so that I could become the teacher that I am today. So I have no regrets for all of that. So I live in Texas now. I run my own dance company. It's called Accelerate Dance and Fitness. It's I guess you can call it a school, but I do private lesson base working with dancers to help them just accelerate and progress wherever they need. So sometimes dancers have, like, say they're struggling with their flexibility. I'm kind of the specialist that can help them progress in those areas that they've done with their teachers and they just can't get any progress in. So that's kind of what I'm doing now.
That's awesome. I haven't heard, like, obviously I haven't heard your like background,
Hmm.
and I feel like this is great foreshadowing to what we're actually talking about. But
Exactly.
first, but first, this is the most important part of the podcast, and you know me well enough to know that no email interaction, no any interaction is complete without a joke.
Of
So,
course.
are you ready for this one?
Yeah, I can't promise you I'm going to get it.
If you don't get it, then there's going to be a problem. It's very.
Yes. Pressure's on.
What do you call a dancing sheep?
A ballerina.
Yeah.
Oh, I figured it out.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, you passed. So that was what we're doing instead of a fun fact for all the viewers who are like, where's the fun fact? That's our fun fact. You get a joke. Uh, so now bouncing back to our main topic. My focus on this episode of the podcast is safe teaching practices in dance. And listening to your like background, I feel like, as I mentioned previously, that your story contributes to the reason why you do what you do today. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. And so when you decided to depart to Texas, we started having these conversations, and it just kind of, when I started college, it just kind of became this like whole conversation of what is like safe teaching practices. And I've learned a lot from talking to you, to the point where it's like, I think that other people should learn a lot from talking to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I'm just going to ask a few questions. Well, first off, what's your favorite style of dance? Just out of curiosity.
Ballet, 100%.
Yeah. Ballet is so fun. Luckily, I've been on a hyper fixation for ballet. So I'm ready. So the first question is like, I think you've answered this earlier, but what is your current involvement in the dance industry?
Yeah, so my running my business, I work with studios and dancers really throughout the whole Dallas area and even some out of state as well, helping them through
Hmm.
their struggles. I work with a lot of like injured dancers that are having to take time off because of their
Hmm.
injury and they're working with their PT, but then they come to me to do like dance conditioning specific to keeping them fit and progressing
Hmm.
in their dance while they're, also healing their injuries too.
Hmm.
So I work with dancers all throughout the dance community. I also teach at Texas Ballet Theater and Chamberlain School of Ballet as well, just a couple times a week. Not a lot. That's not my primary focus, but yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So I think you also answered this earlier, but how did you get interested in studying like dance anatomy and safe dance practice?
So I took anatomy and kinesiology and human biology and all sorts of things in college. And to me, ballet made so much more sense
Hmm.
when they talked about it from an anatomical perspective. I remember taking classes when I was a teenager, and they would always give these analogies, and I'm like, I don't get it. What the heck does that mean?
Right.
And to me, my brain just didn't think that way.
Yeah.
I was not natural to imagery and just thinking about dance in that sense. And I had fun trying to do it, but all of a sudden, when I started to learn the anatomy sides of things and biomechanics, how the body actually worked, it made so much more sense. And I felt like I could actually accomplish things that I was
Hmm.
struggling with. So I really became fascinated in college once
Hmm.
I had a couple of teachers that really started to teach
Right.
with that anatomical background. It was that was a game changer from the beginning. So that was how it started, at least.
Awesome. So, why do you, just out of curiosity, so why do you find it is important for dancers to learn about like anatomy?
Oh my gosh. Number one thing is think of it like, your body is your instrument. How many times do you hear that for dance, right?
All the time.
Take care of it, but you have to learn how to tune it. You have to learn like you can't play the instrument well if you don't know how to like tune the notes and things like that.
Mhm.
Same thing with your body. If you don't know how to take care of it, if you don't even know what the parts are,
Right.
you're not going to be able to be a very good musician. You're not going to be able to be a very good artist and dancer if you don't even know how it functions.
Hmm.
So some people, the anatomy side of things is the way to do it. Sometimes they have an image in their head and they can do it through imagery alone. I have a friend that actually is a teacher that he uses the most amazing imagery, but he is 100% anatomically correct. When he does all of his imagery, it's amazing.
Hmm.
So I adore like listening to his perspective on things as a teacher because he's so right. He's describing it all the right way, just a different perspective. But just the more you can have those tools too, especially because everybody learns differently too, right? Some dancers like me learn better with anatomy and some learn better with imagery. So it's important for a teacher to be able to have both of those skills. But for a dancer, like I said, just understanding your body, if you understand how it works, it's a lot easier to understand how to get it to do the things you're asking
Right.
it to do.
Right. I feel like I did learn that like both ways. Like I've learned rotate using your hip flexors, but I've also learned like the nitty gritty names of all the parts that are used. So it's definitely important. I feel like I like that there are different ways of like obviously like everyone's teaching style is different, but it's
Mhm.
interesting how, you know, how your friend is able to, figure that out without having to know the anatomy behind it.
Yeah.
But I guess it depends on how people's brains work.
Yeah. And it's important to rotate using the deep rotators, not the hip flexors.
Oh, sorry.
That's
That's
okay. You're under
that
pressure. It's hard when you're under pressure.
that's why you're here. So thanks for the correction. So just on the top of your head, are there any specific teaching practices that you are concerned about as a teacher?
Yeah, there are definitely some. One of the big ones that concerns me the most is the partner stretching. I used to teach that more. I don't
Mm-hmm.
anymore because I understand it a lot better now. And the pushing children in, especially little ones, into stretches without communicating what they're feeling or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that, just the pushing into things. There is a lot. So young dancers, their hip sockets don't develop until, I mean, your hip socket's not fully developed until you're a teenager. Like
Mm-hmm.
the acetabulum, the ball in there's the ball in the socket, there's the head of the femur, that's the ball, and then the socket, that's the acetabulum. That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't actually fuse until between 16 to 18 years old. And then even little tiny ones, the head of their femur has not fused yet. So yes, these 3-year-olds are extremely flexible and bendy, but their bones have not finished even forming.
Yeah.
If you're
Yeah.
constantly pushing and pushing and pushing into these bones, just because they can doesn't mean that they can always get away with it. One of my injuries was I had a femoral acetabular hip impingement,
Mm-hmm.
and what that is I had extra bone growth on my hip because I was pushed a lot into stretches, and I pushed and I didn't have a stable hip, kind of moved around a lot and wasn't in a good place in the socket, so I was constantly pushing and pushing and pushing, enough so that the extra friction, it's like you're walking and you have a new pair of shoes, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
shoes are really hard and they rub on your heels and you get a blister, and the blister pops up from all that extra friction. Imagine that happening to your bones.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that can happen over time with young dancers. And unfortunately, I was one of them. Even though I wasn't a dancer early, I did a lot to my body as a gymnast. That back then it wasn't common knowledge. They didn't know any better. But as the dance world is getting more involved in dance science, we're learning better. And there
Mm-hmm.
are plenty of people out there that do know better. Unfortunately, there are still people that don't really understand the body yet. And so the sooner you can learn it, the sooner you'll have an understanding of like, okay, this is good for my body, or it's not good for my body.
Yeah. And I feel like that also ties really well into like the why learning dance anatomy is so important as dancers too. Dancers, teachers, anyone involved in the dance industry. Because like you said, children's bones, their bodies, the whole point of a child's body is to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And I get concerned specifically with seeing children who are so like uber flexible. Like I just can't imagine what kind of injuries they get when they're older
Mm-hmm.
just from being stretched out so young. Going to the partner stretching thing that you mentioned, if the students aren't taught to communicate, if they are not like taught to communicate with each other, I can see that causing a lot of issues. Or if
Mm-hmm.
they're not allowed to like talk or communicate throughout the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
I can definitely see the issue there.
Yeah. And one of the concerns with partner stretching, and really any kind of stretching, in my opinion, now that I learn more and more, is that there are muscle stretches, there are nerve stretches, and there are actual like joint compression that you can feel. So you can feel different things. You can have a room full of dancers doing the same stretch and have them feel 12 different things. So especially if you're pushing into it, one of the most important rules that I always say to dancers anywhere is that a stretch has to be felt where the muscles are getting longer, not on the shortening side of the joint. So, say you're doing a foot stretch with a partner, right? And you're pressing down on the top of their foot, they need to be feeling the stretch on the top of their foot. If they feel anything through the back of their ankle, that's not a stretch, that's a compression. And I'll be honest, I used to give that stretch pretty routinely. And I've had dancers tell me before they felt it in the back of the ankle, and I didn't know any better.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, as as we start to get the word out there with things like podcasts, and I use a lot of social media
Hmm.
to try to just get some of those things out there so that we're not damaging these bodies before they even had a chance to do something with themselves.
Right, absolutely. So, just for the people who don't know anything about dance, can you give me an idea on specific stretches that, not specific, I'm trying to figure out the word. You mentioned like muscle, joint, tendons. So,
Mhm.
so just for the sake of people not knowing a lot about dance, can you give us like a general overview on like what's safe stretching and what isn't?
Yeah, so there's one thing I didn't mention in my little bio I was sharing with you
Hmm.
is where I got most of this knowledge from. So obviously I got some from college, but the bulk of my knowledge has come from Lisa Howell. She runs and operates the Ballet blog. She is a physiotherapist for dancers based in Australia. She's had over 20 years of clinical experience practicing, working with dancers, and she got sick of seeing the same darn injuries over and over again,
Hmm.
things that were easily preventable if people just had more education. So she created this course for dance educators and physical therapists, health practitioners that trains them on these basic fundamental things. And I've done, I think, 4 courses with her so far. I've got another one scheduled in November. And then I also do like bi-weekly coaching calls with her, either live or pre-recorded, to learn about specific topics. We'll like dissect a topic and learn about certain injuries,
Hmm.
certain problems dancers have, and we'll just dive into it. So these are what I learned from her, and I think there's something that need to be common knowledge in the whole community, because I find even like a lot of doctors don't know these things, a
Oh
lot
no.
of really basic things. So there's a joint restriction. So the different things you can feel when you're stretching, there's a joint restriction. A joint restriction you'll feel like deep inside of the joint, right? So if you're trying to bend your back and you feel it deep inside of your spine in one little spot, that's a joint restriction. Okay. If you are bending your hip and you feel it really deep inside, that's a joint restriction. Those are important not to stretch,
Hmm.
because you're just going to compress it more and more. That's when you want to go see a health professional to go have them help with that, work with somebody on some preventative work so that you don't develop an injury from that. I had joint compression in my hips for so many years and stretched through it and had no idea that it was
Hmm.
not a stretch I was feeling. So that's the first kind of restriction. There are also, the next one is neural restrictions. So nerves send impulses to your muscles telling them what to do, right? And what can happen, nerves will slide and glide like dental floss. They don't like to be stretched. So if a nerve gets kind of pinched somewhere, you're going to feel it like a line somewhere down your body. You might feel it down the back of your leg, in your calf. You'll also get a nerve sensation if you feel it in the back of your knee, or if there's any tingling, pins and needles, numbness. That's the sign that a nerve is being pinched somewhere. So nerves don't like to be stretched, so don't hold it in a stretch. So if you feel any of those things, those are not the stretches you want to be holding. I always like to tell people, because it can be kind of confusing what to do about it, is follow the nerve up to where you feel the last pull or the highest pull. Usually there's something tight up higher. So where you feel it is not necessarily where the problem is. For example, I have dancers that will come to me for flexibility and they'll feel a big, huge line down their hamstring. Well, when I follow it up, it goes all the way up into their neck. So I do a little release with them for their neck and their hamstring flexibility increases. Lisa's got a really cool video on YouTube of that specific release. I highly recommend that video if you don't believe me or if you want to see what she means. She describes it so perfectly. So, nerve restriction, don't stretch, follow it up, release higher. Then there is fascial tension. So anytime you're in a stretch and you feel something spread out, anything spread out is fascia. That's the coating that surrounds our muscles. And it's a connective tissue. It loves to be moved and massaged. So again, you don't want to hold those static stretches if you feel it spread out all around your muscles, because fascia has a fight or flight response. So it can actually, if it feels like it's being attacked, it can actually tighten and it will fight back, basically. But if you massage it, make it feel safe, make it feel really good, it's going to go, oh, okay, I'll relax now. That felt so wonderful. So whenever you feel it spread out, that's when you want to be moving through these stretches. And then the least common restriction people actually feel in stretches is a muscle restriction. Imagine that. Most of the
Crazy.
time you don't feel
Crazy.
your muscles. So muscle restriction, you'll feel it like very specifically in that one spot on the muscle. And those don't usually, you can hold those for some static stretches because that will help kind of tune them down a little bit. But most of the time you need strengthening. Then that's usually the best way to get that muscle to not work so hard, is to balance it by working other muscles.
Gotcha. So the muscle one is obviously a safe one. So for example, if you were like, let's say like we were in a class and we were in a lunge. So would that be an example of one of those stretches that we shouldn't hold specifically?
There's no right or wrong answer to what you shouldn't hold. It depends on where you feel it. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're doing a lunge and say you have you feel it really deep in one spot in the front of your hip, really like
Mm-hmm.
pinpointed and really deep and you feel it in one spot in the back leg, that would be one you don't want to hold. Or if you feel it in the back of the back leg, that would be one you don't want to
Mm-hmm.
hold because it's on the closing side of the joint, right? But if you just kind of get it through the front of the hip, it's not a big deal, but you might have more success if you're moving in and out of the lunge if you feel it spread out through the hip. So it's not a bad thing to do that stretch. There's no wrong stretch. There's just the wrong time to hold it.
Right. And do you feel like, well, not do you feel like, how does, because I feel like this is also not really talked about, how does, do you know how temperature plays a role in stretching and getting your body warmed up?
Well, your body will definitely do better when your body is warm, when your muscles are warm. And also, warming up can, if you have fascial tension, fascia likes to be moved. Warming
Mm-hmm.
up first will help release the fascial tension, so you'll actually get to the muscles better. So that's another benefit to doing a
Mm-hmm.
warm up, is just releasing through the fascia.
Gotcha. So how do you teach your students all of that? Because obviously it's like a lot of like big words. So how do you teach your, like obviously you teach private lesson style.
Hmm.
But how do you teach your students like what all of these different stretches are, especially because assuming that they're like younger, like kids,
Hmm.
like how do you teach that to them?
That's a great question. I'm still always playing with how I teach it to figure out what method is best. In group classes, what I do is I will tend to pick a assessment, a way to assess like, okay, where are we tight? So say you're stretching in your straddle. I'll I'll have everybody go sit in their straddle and say, okay, where do you feel your stretch? And we'll kind of go down the line and say, okay, if you are like so and so and you feel it here, go do this. If you are like so and so and feel it here, I want you to do this exercise for it. So
Mm-hmm.
they just start to learn slowly over time. We'll do like one stretch at a time, and
Mm-hmm.
then they'll learn. When I work private lessons, it's so much easier because I can
Yeah.
just instantly say, okay, you feel it here, do this stretch or this release, and then I'll say, okay, go back, recheck, did it help? And they're always like, oh yeah, that was
Mm-hmm.
great. And they're always so surprised because I don't put them in any stretch that they typically do ever.
Mm-hmm.
I do these weird little things. Like sometimes they'll be trying to do like a hamstring stretch, and they feel it behind their knee. So I'll
Mm-hmm.
have them putting their calf over on their kneecap and like digging around in their calf muscle to release their calf. And all of a sudden they'll go back into their hamstring stretch and their leg touches their nose and they're like, how does that work?
Whoa.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's really fun in the private lesson setting. That's really why I switched to doing more of that, because you get so much better results when you do what your body needs. And
Mm-hmm.
I found as a teacher of group classes, especially the larger the class, the less I was able to actually help them the way that I knew I could help them,
Mm-hmm.
because I can't. I can't, separate 16 people and say, okay, what do you need? Okay, what do you need? Okay, what do you need? It's really hard to be that specific. And one of my fears is always giving somebody the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
What might be good for 15 people in the class could be the wrong thing for one dancer in the class. And that was always just
Right.
my fear, especially as I learned more about the body. I just so preferred teaching privately
Mm-hmm.
because I know I'm able to give them my knowledge so much better and give them what they need. And then, sorry, just to reference back what you said, you referenced how do I teach these young people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for my private lessons, I've worked with as young as age 7, but usually 8 and up is what I'll do private lessons for. And it is amazing what
Mm-hmm.
these young kids can do if you give them the knowledge. If you just explain what it is, I cannot believe how much they can do with their bodies at
Mm-hmm.
that age. I've had a 9 or 10-year-old walk in one day and I say, "How are you doing today?" She's like, "Oh, my diaphragm's really tight today. Can we release that?" She's like 9 or 10 years old. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you know that muscle is incredible because that's not even something most dance teachers talk about. And
Mm-hmm.
then I've had an 8-year-old that I was working with to help with some turnout. And I had never tried using these cues with an 8-year-old before. So what was happening was her hip was like shoving forward in the socket. It wasn't centered in the socket. And I just described to her what I would tell a teenager, what I
Mm-hmm.
would tell an adult about like pulling the hip back in the socket. Obviously, I showed her and gave her some details, but she instantly was able to do it at age 8. I
That's
couldn't believe
crazy.
it. So giving these dancers these resources at a young age will give them so much more control over their bodies and give them so much more. It's also going to give them more knowledge to protect themselves in the studio, to know like, oh, you know what? My body's not supposed to feel this way. This is not
Mm-hmm.
good for me. Like I can feel this happening. Yeah, they'll get a lot more control over their body and over their training.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's fascinating. It's like when you like have kids and you're basically told instead of like, using the baby voice, just talk to them as if they're adults. And that really helps their communication. So
Yeah.
basically what I'm getting is just teach a young person like you would teach a teenager.
Yes,
Mostly.
sometimes you have to slow it down a little bit and use smaller words, but I still like kind of like little kids. They say, teach them their anatomy, teach them their
Hmm.
body parts, right?
Yeah.
Same thing. You teach them their body parts. They can learn anatomy at 8. It's
Hmm.
not a bad thing. Yeah, it may not all be absorbed, and that's fine. I wouldn't expect that, but doesn't mean you can't use the words and teach them what the words are and
Hmm.
and they're gonna absorb what they can.
I guess like hacking on to like what you said. You said something that specifically resonated with me, and it was when we would stretch in center, and you know, I love your approach to like, asking the students how they felt, because I know that there have been times where I've been sitting in a ballet class or any class of any kind, and they were like, "Oh yeah, so you should feel the stretch here." And instead of, being like, "Oh, what are you feeling?" giving you a chance to communicate, I would often have to raise my hand because my body's weird. You know this.
And you didn't feel it where they said you should feel it, right?
Nope.
Yeah.
No.
Well, a lot of that's totally normal though. What teachers always, we know our bodies. And
Hmm.
so we've always done the stretch. We've always felt it this way.
Hmm.
It's not the same for every body, a different
Hmm.
body's going to feel it in a different place. And yeah, communication, that's one thing that I have really changed my teaching method to being more conversational,
Hmm.
more of I give it even giving a correction, not just stretching anymore, but I give a correction and I'll say, how does that feel? And sometimes they're like, oh, so much better. And other times they'll be like, I feel like I can't breathe.
Hmm.
Or they'll feel like, oh, it kind of pinches here. And sometimes the correction you give makes things worse, not better. Even though physically, aesthetically, it looks better,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't always feel better. And that's not a sign that the correction is the wrong correction. It just might be the wrong correction for their body at that time. So
Right.
they might be making the right shape, but if they're recruiting different muscles to do that shape, they're going to feel different from how you feel as a teacher when you do that correction. And so I love asking dancers, especially one-on-one. And then I use it as a tool if I ever give them a correction of like, oh, this doesn't feel better or it doesn't feel easier. It tells me I'm not giving them the right correction yet.
Right.
And that I need to do something different as a teacher. Everything, when you do it well, when you do ballet well, it should feel good. It should feel easy. Ballet does not have to hurt.
Right. And like, the professional dancers who are like on stage, like they make it look easy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's ultimately what you want it to look like. Because obviously, if you're in pain, it's very difficult to hide that
Yeah.
you're in pain.
Yeah. And and you will make it look easy when it feels easy too. It's just
Hmm.
gonna look so much more effortless too.
Right. Right. Next question. Are there any misconceptions that can be like, that are normal for dancers, but are actually bad for their body overall that you can think of?
Um, so one common misconception that I think word's getting out now. Again, we're going to keep talking kind of about stretching here
Hmm.
for a little bit. Um, the stretch before class. I can't tell you how many times I've walked down the hall at a studio where I'm like subbing or guest teaching at,
Hmm.
and they're like, "Go stretch before class," and I'm like, "No," and they'll just sit in these stretches, totally cold bodies, totally undoing their muscles. So one thing that is so important for every teacher to know is that this is pretty common knowledge. Some of the specific durations are just there's different thoughts on, but
Hmm.
it's pretty common knowledge out there in the dance science world is that holding a stretch for 30 up to for excuse me holding a stretch for over 30 seconds can deactivate those muscles for up to 45 minutes. So sitting in a stretch in a straddle hanging out talking to your friends for 1 minute before class can deactivate your inner thigh muscles. That can lead to muscular imbalances, and then you're going to have over recruitment of your outer thigh
Hmm.
muscles or your hip flexors. Something's going to have to pick up the slack because those inner thighs are toast. And the one cue that I would recommend all dancers learn, if you have to pick your legs up to get out of the stretch, I'm sure you've probably done this before. I think
Oh,
we
yeah.
all have, doesn't mean we should. If
Hmm.
you physically cannot close your legs, if you physically cannot get out of the stretch by yourself and your legs are like slow and lethargic, that is those muscles not being able to work. You have turned those muscles off. That's
Ouch.
going to continue through class, and you're going to end up compensating if you need those muscles. So, stretching before class is sitting in static stretches, I should say. Dynamic stretches, moving
Hmm.
warm-ups, moving stretches, tennis ball releases, all sorts of things like that are all fine to do before class. But just sitting in that straddle before stretch before class is something that we thought was okay back then, and now we understand the science. But that also holds true for between bar and center. We used to say the stretches for when your bodies are warm, right? That's still pretty common knowledge. But same thing, if you sit in that straddle between bar and center, guess what? You're going to have the same effect when you try to close your legs and you're trying to get up and move, and your legs are like, oh,
Hmm.
I can't do this. So, again, not a good time to stretch. After class, sitting in those static stretches is totally fine as long as you're not compressing the joint or pulling on a nerve or all those other things.
Hmm.
But that's a big one that I still see all over, all over.
It's so stereotypical too.
Yeah, well, and we all, like, we being, people like you in college now, and you're still pretty young as far as the dance world goes,
Hmm.
but people like me, teachers, all former dancers, that's what we grew up doing.
Hmm.
We just have more knowledge now
Yeah.
than we did back then. Another interesting misconception. I would say this does not hurt your body as much physically as it does mentally. So I want to kind of touch on this is there is not, yes, there are bodies that are kind of more natural to ballet
Mm-hmm.
and more naturally, like the hypermobile body is always really pretty, right? We like those naturally arched feet. We love those naturally hyperextended legs, those naturally bendy backs. You know, it's the pretty aesthetic. But there is a misconception that somebody is inherently tight. Somebody inherently has bad feet.
Yes.
This is something that I used to think a little bit differently of. I thought that, like, say you have an osteogonum, the little bone in the back of your ankle, I thought that meant you would never be able to do point well. That's not true.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the times, the people that struggle are struggling because their muscles are not working well together. And if you just change how the muscles work, the body functions so much better. I'm going to share another story from Lisa Howell because she's so amazing. She has so much knowledge, wisdom, so many experiences. I recently did one of her point workshops, and so one of the teachers there is like, so how do you tell a student and a parent that, you know, their daughter is never going to go on point because they don't have good enough feet to be able to access a full point range? Because we were talking about, you know, it's important, a prerequisite to go on point is to have a full point range, right? Make sure you can actually get on the box. Super important, right? So the teacher
Yes.
asked, you know, why, what do you do? And Lisa said, well, that's pretty much never true. That's never the case. So Lisa, doing all of her PT, she's probably worked with hundreds of dancers who didn't have feet that could go on point. And she said that out of those hundreds of dancers, she only had 3 ever she could not get to a full point range. And those 3, she said, were only because of injuries. I think she said that they had some sort of like metal or nails put in their ankle that literally prevented them from being able to access their full range of motion because it was something other than their body. Everybody's
Wow.
body can do it if you have the right tools, if you have the right people, the right help, and if you're looking at the right places too. I work with dancers all the time to help these problem areas, right? So I have dancers come to me because they can't get on their box, you know, and I have, sometimes it's their foot that we need to work on. Sometimes I had one dancer this summer, she didn't get on her box and all I had to do was tell her to engage her quads. She was struggling for months dancing on point and couldn't get on her box, and all of a sudden I told her to engage her quads. She was instantly on point and could do everything, and she left like so happy. Um,
Oh.
but then there's these other dancers that their challenge is not just one place. Sometimes it's the feet, but their feet are picking up slack for their hips and for their core. And so it's a lot like longer, a lot more tedious of a process, and it takes a lot of time and dedication to really small little details. But it doesn't mean it can't happen. You just have to have the time, the patience, the resources to be able to get the help you need to be able to do that. So I say that that is a misconception that can, I would say, hurt a dancer mentally. Like, I can't imagine if I had, I mean, I was told, actually, a little side note, I was told after I auditioned for a prestigious program and all of my peers got in and I did not. I talked to the artistic director about why I did not get in. And I said, what can I work on so I can get in next year? I went up to her and I was asking for help. What can I do? And she said, oh, sweetie, I'm really not allowed to say this to you, but you have a woman's figure. She
Ew.
said, you should focus on other styles of dance. And you know, can I also just say that, you know, I was 16 at the time, and a 16-year-old's body is not fully developed.
Mm-hmm.
I did way more then as a dancer, but I, you know, my body settled down eventually once I stopped having all those like raging hormones that teenagers have, you know. So
Mm-hmm.
even that like was it that I would say is another thing that is it can be hurtful for dancers, right?
Right.
Talking to dancers about like their weight and their body size, especially as teenagers. They are still developing, their bodies have not settled. You know, yes, women mature sooner than men, but that doesn't mean you're done developing. And and that I know like personally did a lot of like mental damage to me
Mm-hmm.
because you know you don't want to hear that. You I was so young and eager. I was willing to do anything it took if they just gave me the right tools.
Mm-hmm.
And they just gave up on me, you know, and that did not feel good. But
It feels terrible.
yeah, so but even like dancers, like telling a dancer, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't take you, your feet aren't good enough." I
Mm-hmm.
would say, "Don't do that. Send them to me. Send them to
Mm-hmm.
somebody else." You say, "I can't take you yet because you need to work on this. Here are some resources of people who might be able to help you, but right now for safety, you can't go on point yet." I that would be my approach, right?
Right.
Give them resources. You can't just tell them no.
Right.
That's not fair.
Yeah. And I do want to say, like, on the record, in my opinion, that if anybody, if anybody like tries to like make a comment about like body size, weight, etc., that is not okay, and that is a red flag. And
Mm-hmm.
so I want to make that very clear for people. If someone is in that environment and their authority figure, especially an authority figure, is saying something like that, that is a red flag, and that is not okay. I just want to say that on the
Yeah.
record.
And dancers need to know. Sorry, I'm kind of going kind of off topic, but kind of on topic. I've had a couple of dancers this past year that worked with me. They came to me and started taking my classes, and they ended up leaving their other studio because they didn't realize that good teachers could be nice. They until they came and took a class from me, they thought that it was normal for their teachers to be mean to them. They thought
Yeah.
that was the sign of a good teacher, was just being hard and mean, and like belittling the students was totally normal. And so it's so important for anybody listening that if you're in an environment like that, it doesn't have to be that way. If you have somebody judging your body, you know, it doesn't have to be that way. Go somewhere else, please. You know,
Yeah.
let's start to change the dance world a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's not let these places get away with it. Make them change their tune because they're losing students left and right
Mm-hmm.
because nobody wants to take from them because of how they act. They'll probably start to change their tune then and
Right.
realize that it's not okay anymore. And then we're going to get more nice teachers.
Yes. And the mean teachers can go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually do think that this conversation is very much on topic to this episode, especially because, there is like taking care of your body safely physically, and then there's also taking care of your body mentally.
Hmm.
And getting comments like that, especially being young, it can affect how you dance too. Like when you are in a classroom with a terrible teacher, a terrible environment, it affects, like, regardless of like what their comments are. This is just an environmental standpoint. It affects how people dance in general, because ultimately, like, that would make the dancer feel insecure. Hence, they're not thinking about their muscles. They're just thinking about, surviving, I guess.
Yeah.
So I do think that this is very on topic, and I do appreciate that we're getting into this because it's important.
Yeah. I
Um,
agree.
so I guess more of like a segue. So if you were able to, so let's say you were like, let's say there was like a very specific curriculum to how ballet is taught, which there is. So what kind of changes would you make to the general ballet class as a whole, if you could?
Um, that's a great question. I haven't thought too much about. I know there's a whole bunch of different curriculums out there already,
Mhm.
but as we get more information, one thing is keeping students in parallel longer. You know, these young hips are not developed. We are supposed to live our lives in parallel. You know, we walk down the street in parallel, we walk up the stairs in parallel, we bend over to pick something up in parallel. establishing a good, correct parallel can help give better hip stability over time. I know ABT curriculum, I don't think introduces turnout at all till age 8. So I know that that's one of the curriculums. I haven't studied their program, but I do know of that. That's like new and different. And everybody was like, what in the beginning?
Yeah.
Even myself. But as I gain more knowledge, I'm like, you know what? That's actually a really good idea.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you start them correctly, they're going to be so much more successful in the long run. The more I teach, the more I realize that, especially when I'm working with these dancers that have like issues, right? They're working
Mm-hmm.
on their feet. It comes back to the basics. I don't work on their feet and the hard stuff. I have to go back to the very beginning and retrain what they know in the beginning. And that's what it comes down to every single time,
Mm-hmm.
is making sure that foundation is right. So I would also just say, like, taking your time to like lift the leg. Like, the leg doesn't have to be above 90. I had a student, this made me so happy. I had a student that was at SAB over the summer, and she came back and I asked her what she thought of the program. She loved it. And I asked her, so what did you like about it? What was so great about their program? And she talked about, she loved the nuances. They didn't want you to like squeeze everything. They wanted you to like find the subtleties of the movement. But then she also said, they told us we were not allowed to lift our leg above 90, ever.
Yes, I like that. That's
And
awesome.
and she said, she's like, it took away the competition. She's like, it wasn't about who can lift their leg the highest then. It was about who can, it allowed them to internally focus on their technique and focus on making sure their technique was as strong as it can be. So that would definitely be something that I would work into the curriculum, is really making sure that they have progressions, that you have this before you do this, like a good demi plie before you do a grand plie,
Mm-hmm.
that you have a good balance in passe before you do a pirouette. And granted, that's the way I think most teachers try to do it, but I do find that still there's often too much too soon,
Mm-hmm.
and those fundamentals are still not always set properly. And that can be hard to do in a class when half the
Mm-hmm.
class gets it and then the other half of the class doesn't, because you do have to keep the students interested. So I do want to acknowledge that there's that whole other side of things. Like, we
Mm-hmm.
want dance to be fun. We
Yeah.
want kids to enjoy it. We want them to feel like they're moving. So there is a whole other argument to this that I could also argue. But as far as safety goes, that would be one of my arguments, is just taking your time. Don't rush it. As much as we want to do more and more and more,
Yeah.
it comes back to your plies and your tendus every time.
Yeah. There's like the aspect of like, yeah, like dance is fun, dance is like kind of carefree. Like there is that side of it, but then there's the part where they get injured, and this is just my personal opinion, but it's like not a great time. It's kind of similar to like really any sport or any activity you so desperately want to like, and I would even say gymnastics too. Like and I'm speaking from, I say our personal experience because I know we worked on this, is aerials. So
Remember those days.
yeah. Oh, those were the good old days. But you know, in order for me to do an aerial, I can't just go right in and do an aerial. I had to, do a cartwheel, and then I had to do there's so many, the pop one, the one
Yeah.
where you have to like pop your hands.
Yeah.
And then you have to do the one-handed cartwheel perfectly. And then you have to do like the pop with the one hand.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the part where your arms were in the air. I don't know how I remember this. This was over 4 years ago at this point.
It's longer than that. Yeah.
It's the little things. But there was also the part where I had to keep my arms up and then not put them down until the very last minute.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually we kind of progressed to an aerial, which I would say I kind of got. But like that's one of those examples where it's like you want to do the fun flips and the tricks, and same for ballet, you want to do the fun fouettes and the pirouettes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the whole, it's not fun when you're injured. Like, it may be fun at first, but once you do an aerial and then you land the wrong way on your ankle,
Mm-hmm.
that isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that's one of my passions. I can't help myself. That's where I stand on that. So I, yeah. But artistry is also definitely great too. So, how could dancers incorporate their artistry while being safe, especially as kids?
That's really, I find, two things. Number one, good technique is good artistry.
Hmm.
That's number one. But then number two, it's all the épaulement, the the hands, the head, the shoulders, how you coordinate the upper body, I think really adds a lot of artistry. Your timing and dynamics can
Hmm.
really build the artistry. And really once you know the body, using like your fascial system to your
Right.
advantage, it can help build your artistry too, to get those really sharp quick movements that
Hmm.
stop suddenly and then it's like, ooh, that was surprising.
Yeah.
So I think that learning the body can help your artistry a lot, but then there's also all the upper body nuances, like, anatomy. You don't need to know much anatomy to have beautiful hand placement, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah.
So, or beautiful facial expressions. You don't have to know your anatomy for that. Even some of the épaulement with the head, there are some anatomy things I have to work on with some people there that struggle with it. But most of the time, people can just turn their head and put it there. It's not a big deal. Every once in a while, you get somebody who
Hmm.
cannot physically place it, and then we have other things that we need to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important for dancers to know too that like you can find your artistry not just in like, the cool tricks and the cool turns. Like
Yeah.
there are many other ways you can develop artistry. So I like that you like mentioned that.
Hmm.
Um, we are hitting the end of this episode, but is there anything else that you would like to add that I didn't ask you about that you would want to say?
Yeah, one last thing probably is just a recommendation for dancers. You are your own best advocate. If something doesn't feel right, say something. If
Hmm.
something doesn't, you know, if something doesn't even feel right, if it feels wrong that, I don't know, that you're doing something, I don't know, just like speak up for yourself. I feel like the dance world is so trained to respect your teacher, but I don't think there's enough training for a teacher to respect a student.
Hmm.
And I think that we need to do better there, and let that communication go both ways. It's not
Yes.
just teacher is all knowing, oh my goodness, bow down to the teacher, because we do that in reverence, right?
Yeah.
but but it's also like the teacher can learn things from their students too.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I guess like reversing it a bit. And I feel like you answered this question already, but if you were to like say anything to dance teachers who are not really up to par when it comes to, what we talked about today, is there anything you would like to say to them as well
um
that you can think of? I know I'm throwing that one on you.
i I would say two things. One thing, if you give a student a correction and you give them the same correction 3 times, I don't remember where I heard this. I heard this from somewhere else. If
Hmm.
you give them the same correction 3 times and they're not fixing it, you're not correcting the problem.
Hmm.
So the problem's probably somewhere else. So as a teacher, you can just look elsewhere. Don't think that the student's not listening to you. I feel like
Hmm.
so much we think it's, oh, the student isn't trying, the student isn't working hard. Really, in reality, I find so much of the time it's we're not giving them the tools they need. And if you give them a different set of tools, they can succeed. And if you don't have the answer as a teacher, if you can't figure it out, send them to somebody that can help
Yep.
them. It doesn't mean that you're a bad teacher. We just all have different skill sets and different, knowledge base. It's okay to outsource to specialists like Pilates instructors, like people that have done Lisa's program like me, or even just sending them to a PT sometimes. Oftentimes a PT can do preventative work to help them with their dancing, even if it's not injury related.
Hmm.
So just send them to somebody with knowledge about the body, because I feel like so much teachers assume it's the student's fault and that they're not trying, that they're not getting it. And I think it's really that they're not getting the tools.
Yeah, that aligns absolutely. So, I guess my last question, and this is we're getting near the very end here. Obviously, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but if anyone is interested in looking more into what you're doing, what would you recommend?
As far as like studying what I study or
Um,
like working with me?
Studying, or if people want to stay, if people want to see what you're doing on social media, etc. So I guess
Yeah.
both, all around.
Okay. So I've got a couple social media accounts. I've got my Facebook is Accelerate Dance and Fitness, and then my Instagram is still under my name, Becca Buller Sigmund. If you want to follow me there, I do lots of videos just to promote awareness and help dance teachers and students just have more knowledge through problems. And then if anybody's interested in like pursuing more of this, I always sound like a broken record, but I cannot recommend Lisa Howell's program enough. She pinpoints exactly what dance teachers need to
Mm-hmm.
know. It's not just all of the science and anatomy you'll go and learn in college. Hers, she teaches it so specifically to what dancer problems are and what we
Mm-hmm.
need to know. I've done like I can't talk. PBT, Progressing Ballet Technique program.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great program, but it's not nearly as specific as Lisa's is. So Lisa's program really, I mean, it changed everything I thought I knew
Mm-hmm.
about dance. You know, I thought I was super knowledgeable, and she would just blew my mind with how much else
Mm-hmm.
out there is to learn.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, this is the end of this episode. It's been amazing having you on. I appreciate you educating the world about, dance safety, dance practice. And I feel like I've learned a lot just from today alone. And it's definitely going to change the way that I warm up personally before classes, especially. I have some hard ones coming up. Now I know. Now I know how to prepare for them. So
Yeah, nice. I'm glad I can be of some
that
help.
so yeah, I guess I'm gonna sign off
All right.
recording. But thank you all for watching, and bye, audience.
Bye.
Thank you for watching this episode of Dissecting Dance Kicking It with Ren podcast. If you can hear the wonderful background music, those are water bottles. This is your sign that you should relax and drink some water. Anyways, a new episode will be uploaded every other Thursday. Thank you for watching.